Alright guys, in the last lesson, we saw the simplest form of requesting data from external servers. We just sent a GET request to the Bitcoin servers at Bitcoin Average, and we used a predefined route in order to get back the price of any three of our cryptocurrencies in any three of these currencies. So effectively, somewhere on their server, they've got these predefined routes that can take post requests. So it will be something like app.post, and it'll be something like .. /BTC USD. And then in this case, what are they going to do? And then there'll be another one for, say, app.post, targeting the route / Ethereum to EUR. And all of these have been pre-planned so you can hit them up simply by changing your URL. Now, the reason why they have these predefined routes is because they are commonly used. Very frequently, most people will need to know what is the price of Bitcoins in US dollars. Now, what if we wanted a specific piece of data? Well, then, as we saw before, we need to provide some parameters that grabs the relevant piece of data that we want. So let's see how we can do that in this lesson and make the functionality of our website even better. Now, if you head over to Bitcoin Average's documentation, and if we take a look at one of these tabs, which is the price conversion. So Bitcoin Average's API, or rather their server, is able to return a conversion from a start currency to a resulting currency. So this means that we can extend the functionality of our website to allow us to build a conversion tool. So for example, we could say something like, how much is my 3.5 Bitcoins worth in pounds? And it would be able to use this price conversion API to get us the correct price based on those specific inputs that we sent over. So in order to do that, we need to know how to work with parameters and how to send over parameters using the request module and Node. So as we saw before, in order to add parameters to the URL, then you simply start off the list of parameters with a question mark. So everything that comes after the question mark are parameters. And each parameter has a key and a value. So the key goes in front of the equal sign and the value goes afterwards. And you can separate the parameters using a ampersand or the and symbol. So in this case, this URL is taking 3 inputs into this post request, and that request is being made from our browser, but nonetheless, it will return us the data. So we're saying that we want to convert from BTC to USD, and the amount that we want to convert is 2 Bitcoins to USD. So when I hit enter here, you can see that my JSON visualizer is catching that JSON result, and we can see the result that we get back. So the first thing is, did the request go through successfully? And the second thing is, how much is 2 Bitcoins worth in US dollars? So that's about 15,000. And the current time when this request was made. So the time point at which this price is true. So this is how we would do it in the browser. Now, in order to do this on our server using Node and request, we'll have to take a look at the request module's documentations. So far we've only really looked at the beginning of this document, but if you scroll down here, you can see that this module allows you to do a whole bunch of very complicated things. But what we're interested in is the section where it says all available options. Now, how did I know to find it here? Well, I actually read through this entire document. And very often when you're working with documentation from open source module, you do have to do quite a bit of trawling and reading through it in order to find what you're looking for. But you are rewarded with finding out how to do specific things that you want using these packages of code. So if we take a look here under the other options that we can pass into our request, you can see that previously we've simply called the method request, and then we passed in a URL and a callback. But you can see that it's also possible for us to, instead of just passing a simple string as a URL, we can also pass in some options. Now the options, as they say here, is an object. And the only required option is the URI, or the URL basically, of the API that we're trying to request. So that is one of the properties of this options object, and that is the only one that is required. Everything else is optional. And that includes things like the method, so our request method. Do we want to make a GET request or a POST request? And you can see that this defaults to GET if you don't specify any values to it. And then you've got things like QS, which is an object that contains query string values that are going to be appended to the URL. So basically, the request module is going to do this part for us. So we provide the base URL, and it will append all of the properties that we want to send along with our request by using this QS object. So while we could just append all of these things together and append the ampersands and the query string and the question mark and all of that, instead, request allows us to do all of that and more, but much more elegantly. So let's see how we would do this. Now let's change our request so that instead of passing in the final URL, we're going to pass in an object called options. And then we're going to create this object called options. And remember that we create JavaScript objects by giving it a name and then setting it to equal some properties or methods inside a set of curly braces. So inside here, the first option I'm going to specify is the URI or the URL. So you can use either of these keys, it doesn't matter. So I'm going to call ours URL because that's what we've been working with so far. And the URL that we're going to pass in is going to be the base URL from this particular API. So you can see that the base URL is everything before the question mark. So we can copy that and paste it inside here. And now we're going to a different route because we're trying to use a different part of the API. So I can now delete this final URL part where we're concatenating strings together, and instead I can simply say the URL is just this base URL, or you can just paste that in here as well. Now, after we've got our URL, the next property that we want to have in here is the method of making the request. So the method that we want is actually a GET request. So we know that by default, all requests are made as GET requests unless we specify explicitly that it should be otherwise. But just so that we minimize confusion, let's add this in anyways, just so that when we look at our code, it's very, very obvious what it is trying to do. So at the moment, we've got a request and we're going to pass in a bunch of options that includes the base URL and the method that our request is going to make. Now, the next thing that we're going to add is our QS, or query strings. So the key is QS, and it's really important that when you're using request or any other library, that when they specify this is how you use something, as in this is the key that you have to use, then you have to stick with that. You can't just make up your own name, question string. Because this method request comes from the request module that we included. And these keys are predefined when they created this method. So that's why reading the documentation is really, really important. And I know how tempting it is to buy a new TV and just throw away the instruction manual. That's what I do all the time. But in this case, you do, and you really should read the documentation every time you're using a new module or a new API to look at their documentation and follow the instruction manual. So we have to name this QS, and it says over here that this is again a JavaScript object. So that means we can open up a set of curly braces and we can put in some query strings that we need. So in our case, we need 3 query strings. One is from, the second one is to, and the third one is amount. Now, as they say here, amount is not required, as you can see here. But if you don't specify an amount, then it'll default to 1. So in our case, we do want the amount as well as the other 2. So let's add those in there. So we've got one that's called from, another one that's called to, and the third one is called amount. And remember that these words came from the Bitcoin Averages APIs. This is so that their server will be able to understand the data that we're passing in. That's why we're using these specific keywords. So the currency that we want to convert from is going to be our variable crypto, which remember would store the value that the user chose from the first drop-down menu. And the second variable, the fiat, will have a value that's equal to whatever the user selected in the list of fiat currencies. And finally, we need a way for the user to specify the amount that they want to convert. So let's head into our index.html and add another input. And this input is just going to be a simple text input, but it needs to have a name so that we can identify it. And we'll just call it amount. It's not going to have a value because that's going to be determined by the user. And now if we hit save, we can tap into the amount. We can either create a variable to capture that amount and say request.body.amount, or you can simply add it straight up over here. So now that we've got all of our options set up as a JavaScript object, the next thing to do is take a look at our request method call. So our request is going to take all of our options as an input, and then it's going to have a callback. Now in the callback, we can't simply just tap into data.last anymore because it's not the same structure anymore. If you take a look over here, this is an example response and it shows you the structure of it. There's only 3 items in this JSON that gets returned: success, time, and price. So what we need is to tap into the data.price in order to get the current price of the amount of crypto in this fiat currency. So let's go ahead and log that price. And it's probably also a good idea to add a placeholder just so that we can tell the user what to put in here. And we'll call it quantity. So let's hit save. All right, so now this is our current version of the website. It takes a quantity of Bitcoins and it converts it into US dollars or whatever it is that you choose. So let's try it out. Let's say 2.5 Ethereum in euros. Click check. And remember that we haven't yet completed that second part. So let's take a look inside our console for the price. So currently 2.5 Ethereum is worth 1,200 euros roughly. So that seems to be working. But the thing that's not quite working is the text that we're sending back. Now this worked for our previous website because we were only getting the price of 1 Ethereum or 1 Bitcoin. But in this case, we actually have to change this statement so that it prints the amount that the user typed in into this statement. And the other thing is that the current date is undefined. And that's because we're trying to tap into data.display timestamp, which is the format of the JSON that we got back from our previous API endpoint. But in the current API, what we need to tap into is just data.time in order to get that timestamp. So let's go ahead and change that. So the current date is data.time. Or if you wanted to, you can also copy the path here. And then instead of saying the current price of, we're going to tap into that variable amount. And we're going to say amount plus crypto is currently worth this price in fiat. So let's hit save and let's see if we've managed to fix that. So let's check what 5.25 Litecoins are worth in pounds. So the current date is working. So at this particular time point, 5.25 LTC is currently worth 433 pounds. So brilliant. We've incorporated the price conversion API, passing it into our website. And we've set up our servers to talk to Bitcoin Averages servers to grab the specific pieces of data that the user has requested using their APIs and the specified parameters. We also looked at the options that the request module comes with and use this module depending on our purpose. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to be building a larger and more exciting project so that we're not only just making GET requests with APIs, but we also look at how we can make POST requests so that we can post some pieces of data to an external source. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.